There's been a lot of consternation recently with the, Necrotic Gnome's decision to sort of refactor OSE using the advanced rules. And if you're not familiar with the advanced rules, this is basically taking the AD&D split species and class and making that the basis for old school essentials going forward. Now, personally, this is not something that bothers me because one, BX has been around forever. And if you want BX, you can get BX on drive-through, the original TSR versions. There are other retro clones if you're interested in that. And it's had a great run, and it's not going anywhere. Right? OSE isn't consigning species as class, the BX style, into the void. It's just not going to be OSE's base going forward. And I understand it just because when I'm looking on Reddit, a lot of the stuff that I see, and other forums also, is people looking for the advanced style setup. OSE may be trying to evolve itself. More people are more comfortable with a split with someone's genetic heritage and their class than having them together. Now, all that being said, when the people come looking for advanced classes, they're looking to fulfill player requests. Player wants to do X, Y, or Z, and it's not present in the base, 5 or 6 classes that are in BX, and they want something else. It's much easier to get a lot more variations when you split it up, because then you can have, fighter elf, fighter halfling, fighter dwarf, fighter whatever. You can just get a lot more combinations much more easily than you can in the race as class, the species as class that you see in BX. That being said, it's pretty darn easy to take these things, make them species specific. What it invites you to do is to look at what is the species-specific version of this class. If you're going to have a dwarf cleric, if you just take dwarf and cleric and bolt them together, you get a dwarf and a cleric. Sure, you get a dwarf cleric. But that dwarf cleric isn't substantially different than a human cleric, and you could start adding a bunch of stuff to try to differentiate it. But if you then instead say, well, let me not look at dwarf and cleric separately, but let me see what a dwarf cleric is together, maybe we'd hyphenate it, then I think it really asks you to think about, well, what makes a dwarf cleric different than the human cleric? And just for some ideas, if you happen to be thinking about dwarf clerics, maybe instead of turning undead, they have some kind of elemental interaction. Maybe they can summon elementals and potentially dismiss them as well, because I don't think you're going to run into nearly as many elementals as undead. So maybe saying, okay, dwarves, your dwarf cleric doesn't have anything to do with undead, but they can potentially summon and dismiss, banish earth elementals, let's say. Maybe not even all elementals, just earth elementals. And you could think about the same thing with your elf clerics. Okay, well, maybe elf clerics don't turn undead either. Maybe that's really a human cleric specific thing, but maybe they could talk to beasts and plants and things of the wild. Stones, like Legolas does. I guess it's in Fellowship of the Ring, actually hears the stones talking about the elves of old and is able to hear them. So maybe you take that sort of effect and you give it to elves. Depending on how you see dwarves, maybe you think, I want to give that stone talk ability to dwarf clerics instead. Hey, great. These are already ideas. And of course, then you can think about what elvish assassins might be like, or halfling clerics. What are they like? And the key is you don't have to come up with these all at once. Just, you can posit it out there and someone says, hey, I want to play a dwarf cleric. You say, great. And then you come up with a dwarf cleric class. Or if you're running an adventure and you want dwarf clerics to be a thing, you don't have to come up with 800 of these iterations all at once. I mean, unless you want to. Some people like that stuff. But if you don't want to, then don't. I'm not sure where I'm going to cut this in, but I'm going to cut this in somewhere. One of the things that I think I'm not going to call it an issue necessarily, but I think that there's this expectation, maybe on behalf of players and referees, GMs alike, that your class choices have to be like a diner menu, where it's got to be 8 pages long and have specialties from all over the known universe from which to choose. And I simply just don't think this needs to be the case. I simply come up to a player and say, hey, what do you want to play? And if they ask about the setting, you can give some setting-specific information. They ask about certain species, you can give species-specific information. And if they show interest in one particular thing or another, then just make them that class. But I think too often, people feel like they have to have all the options laid out and ready to be chosen off the bat. And I just disagree with that. I think it just puts a lot more work on you as a world builder, on you as a referee, than there needs to be. Now, of course, a lot of systems give you all those out of the gate, but then you end up with the expectation that what I see happen in the 5e circles all the time, where people expect that your setting has to have everything that is known under the multiverse in their setting. And I believe that this doesn't need to be the case, that your setting doesn't have to be beholden to a Forgotten Realms version of D&D or any particular version of D&D. So if you just start with a premise of say, hey, here are the species that are sapient in my setting, and then just work with your players as part of a session 0 or session -1 of, okay, you're going to play the game. Here's what's going on in the setting. How would you like to interact with that? Then you can just build things as they come up. I don't know if this will work for everybody, and some people may feel like that they won't see a possibility until they've seen it expressed on paper. But I just think as a solution that gives you, as the referee, guidelines to work with that is doable and not putting out a ton of work that you may not ever use. You create 30 classes, but in your campaign, people are only going to choose a few of them at a time. And then as a player, if you're going to tell me that you can't visualize without seeing it on paper, I'm not going to say that can't ever happen, but I would say that just work with your GM. If you say, hey, you know what, I'm going to be a cleric, but I kind of want to be an elf. What does that look like? Well, then you start that dialogue. All right. I'll cut this in somewhere. Back to the remainder of the video. If you're thinking about, well, I want to keep BX having species and class as one, great. You can still give your player, here are all these different options for classes, and here are the different species there are. And when they pick one, or they're interested in one, then you say, okay, well, let's work on what we think a class of that type looks like in a culture of this species. Coming up with classes, coming up with species. I think this stuff should be fun. Let me know what you think. Game on, everybody. Talk to you later.